Sometimes grief makes us do things we never thought we would. When Daniel Kessler lost his father to an overdose, he also lost his faith in God. One Sunday afternoon, after a bitter text exchange with his religious mother, Daniel walked past St. Martin's Catholic School, and his anger exploded. He kicked the Virgin Mary statue near the chapel doors. The video spread across town, sparking outrage. But instead of pressing charges, the church did something unexpected. Father Jim asked Daniel to come back every afternoon to repair what he had broken. Something happened during those quiet hours of fixing paint and plaster. Something that made an angry young atheist drop to his knees in prayer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound prayer book sat on Daniel's nightstand like an accusation. 3 years after his father's death, he still couldn't bring himself to throw it away, though he'd stopped believing in the words inside long before Michael Kessler took his final breath. Daniel remembered when that book meant everything to his father. During the good years, before the construction accident, Michael would read from it every morning at the kitchen table, whispering prayers for his family's safety. Young Daniel would sometimes join him, feeling important and holy in those quiet moments. St. Martin's Catholic School had been the center of their spiritual life. The red brick building stood 3 blocks from their house on Maple Street, and Daniel had started there in kindergarten. But it was serving as an altar boy that truly captured his imagination. Father Jim had noticed him during Sunday Mass, the way he paid attention during readings. At 10 years old, Daniel began training for the sacred duty of assisting at the altar. His father had been so proud. Michael would beam from the 3rd pew on the left whenever Daniel emerged from the sacristy, in his crisp white surplice. Those were the golden years, when faith felt as natural as breathing. The Kessler family attended every feast day, participated in parish festivals. Margaret sang in the choir, her clear soprano voice lifting the congregation. Michael coached the church softball team and helped with maintenance projects. Then came the accident. Daniel was 13 when the scaffolding collapsed at the downtown construction site where his father worked. Michael spent 3 months in the hospital, underwent 4 surgeries, and emerged with a permanent disability. The prescription bottles began multiplying on their kitchen counter. OxyContin, Percocet, Tramadol. At first, the medication helped. Michael could walk again, could attend Mass with his family, but prescription pain relief has its own gravity. Daniel didn't understand the science then, how opioids rewire the brain, how tolerance builds. He only knew that his father needed more pills more often, that their conversations grew shorter, that the man who once read prayers with devotion now seemed perpetually distracted. Margaret responded by intensifying her own spiritual practices. She attended daily Mass instead of just Sundays, joined additional prayer groups, their house filled with religious artifacts, crucifixes, saint cards, rosary beads draped over doorknobs. She spoke frequently of offering up their suffering for the salvation of souls. Daniel tried to maintain his altar boy duties, but it became difficult to focus on sacred mysteries while his family disintegrated. His father missed more Masses, claiming back pain kept him bedridden. During the consecration, when Father Jim raised the chalice, Daniel found himself questioning whether God was truly present, whether any of this ritual meant anything. The final year was the hardest. Michael lost 40 pounds, became secretive about medications, started borrowing money with elaborate excuses. He pawned his wedding ring, then Margaret's jewelry. The parish softball team got a new coach. The 3rd pew on the left began to feel cavernous with only Daniel and his mother. Daniel's faith began fracturing. If God was all-powerful, why didn't he heal his father's pain? If prayer could move mountains, why did their desperate supplications seem unanswered? By senior year, Daniel had stopped serving at Mass altogether. He attended Sunday services to avoid confrontations with his mother, but his heart had hardened into polite skepticism. The overdose happened on a Tuesday morning. In March, 3 weeks before Daniel's high school graduation, Margaret found Michael in their bedroom, surrounded by empty pill bottles and the leather prayer book that had fallen from his nightstand. The paramedics worked for 37 minutes, but Michael Kessler was already gone. Now, at 19, Daniel existed in the strange space between his former faith and current doubt. He'd moved back home after his first semester at community college, partly to save money, but mostly to keep an eye on his mother, whose grief had calcified into rigid religious routine. She attended Mass twice daily, spent hours kneeling before their home shrine. Daniel worked part-time at Henderson's hardware store, taking general studies classes because he genuinely didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. His best friend Alex Chen attended State University an hour away, studying engineering. They stayed in touch through text messages, but their friendship had acquired the bittersweet quality that marks most high school relationships after graduation. The apartment Daniel shared with his mother sat 6 blocks from St. Martin's. He'd developed the habit of timing his errands to avoid walking past the school, taking longer routes rather than confront the memories embedded in those red bricks. The sight of children in plaid uniforms reminded him too sharply of his own innocent certainty. Margaret still attended the same Mass times, still occupied their traditional pew, still participated in parish activities with desperate devotion that made other parishioners uncomfortable. She cooked elaborate meals that Daniel barely touched, tried to engage him in conversations about college and future plans, never directly mentioning the growing distance between them. But her eyes held a constant pleading expression, silently begging him to return to the fold. Father Jim had baptized Daniel as an infant, confirmed him as a teenager, and presided over his father's funeral with gentle dignity. Now, in his 70s, the priest moved more slowly, but still possessed sharp eyes that had first recognized Daniel's spiritual potential. He never pressured Daniel to return to active participation, but his warm greetings during their occasional encounters carried an implicit invitation that Daniel found both comforting and unsettling. The leather prayer book remained on Daniel's nightstand, a daily reminder of questions he couldn't answer and faith he couldn't recover. Sometimes, in moments of particular loneliness, he would pick it up and read his father's handwritten notes in the margins. Brief prayers for strength, expressions of gratitude, desperate pleas for healing that never came. This was Daniel's world. On that fateful Sunday afternoon, suspended between belief and skepticism, love and resentment, the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming, he carried his grief like a weight that had settled so deeply into his bones that he'd almost stopped noticing its presence until moments like today, when something would shift that burden and remind him how heavy his sorrow truly was. Daniel woke that Sunday morning to the sound of church bells echoing across the neighborhood. March 15th, 3 years exactly since his father's overdose. He'd hoped the anniversary might pass quietly, but his phone was already buzzing. With a text from his mother, "Memorial Mass at 10 a.m. Your father would want you there. Please, Danny." He stared at the message for a long moment, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Through his bedroom window, he could see families walking toward St. Martin's in their Sunday best, children skipping ahead while parents checked their watches. The familiar scene filled him with a mixture of nostalgia and resentment. "Can't make it working today," he typed back. Though Henderson's hardware was closed on Sundays, his mother's response came immediately. "You're lying, and you're hurting yourself more than me. Leave me alone, Mom. Your father loved you. God loves you. When will you stop punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault?" Daniel's hands shook as he read the words. Wasn't his fault? He'd watched his father deteriorate for 3 years without doing anything meaningful to help. He'd stopped serving at Mass when his father needed spiritual support most. He'd been angry and distant during those final months, more concerned with his own embarrassment than his father's pain. "Stop texting me about God. He didn't love Dad enough to save him." The phone stayed silent after that. Daniel immediately regretted his harshness, but pride kept him from apologizing. He dressed in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, grabbed his wallet, and headed out into the crisp morning air, needing to walk off the tension that had settled in his chest. Without consciously choosing the route, his feet carried him toward downtown, past the hardware store, past the coffee shop where he and Alex used to study, past the intersection where his father's construction company used to pick up day laborers. The anniversary had stirred up memories he usually kept buried, fragments of conversations and moments that played on repeat in his mind. "Danny, you're a good boy," his father had whispered during one of their last coherent conversations. "Don't let what's happening to me make you lose your faith. Promise me." But Daniel hadn't promised. He'd mumbled something non-committal and changed the subject to safer ground. Baseball scores, weather, anything but the spiritual concerns that seemed to occupy his father's increasingly fragmented thoughts. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo from his mother. The memorial candle she'd lit at church, flickering before the altar where Daniel had once served Mass with such dedication. The image caption read, "He's with God now, whether you believe it or not." These words hit him like a physical blow. Daniel stopped walking, overwhelmed by a surge of rage so pure and unexpected that it left him breathless. 3 years of suppressed anger erupted all at once. At his father for choosing pills over family, at his mother for her relentless religious pressure, at God for his apparent indifference to human suffering, at himself for caring so deeply about things that seemed ultimately meaningless. He looked up and realized he was standing directly in front of St. Martin's Catholic School. The irony wasn't lost on him. Mass had just ended, and families were emerging from the chapel entrance, children running across the lawn while parents chatted in small groups. Several people glanced in his direction, recognizing him despite the years that had passed since he'd been a regular presence in their community. The Virgin Mary statue stood near the chapel doors, exactly where it had been since Daniel's childhood. He'd passed it thousands of times, sometimes pausing to notice how the morning light caught the folds of her stone robes, how her face maintained an expression of serene acceptance no matter what chaos surrounded her. As a young altar boy, he'd been taught that Mary was the perfect model of faith, trusting God's plan, even when it seemed impossible, finding peace in surrender to divine will. Looking at her now, Daniel felt only mockery in that peaceful expression. What did a statue know about real suffering? What comfort could carved stone offer to a teenager watching his father disappear into addiction? What good were prayers and devotion and faith when the people you loved most still ended up dead on bedroom floors? His phone buzzed with another text from his mother. "I'm lighting a second candle for you. Come home when you're ready to talk." The condescension in those words, the assumption that he would eventually come around, return to the fold, accept the same empty consolations that had failed his family so completely, pushed Daniel past his breaking point. Before he could think, or reason, or consider consequences, he stepped forward and kicked the statue with all the force his anger could summon. The impact sent vibrations through his leg and a sharp crack through the morning air. Mary's serene face now bore a visible chip across her left cheek, and her outstretched hand had broken off entirely, lying in 3 pieces on the grass. Daniel stared at the damage in horror, his rage instantly replaced by shock at what he'd done. "Hey!" a voice called from across the lawn. "What are you doing?" Daniel turned to see several parishioners staring at him in disbelief, including 2 teenagers with their phones already out, recording. Mrs. Patterson, his second-grade teacher, covered her mouth in shock. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd coached alongside his father, shook his head sadly. "Daniel Kessler," called Sister Mary Catherine, emerging from the chapel. "What have you done?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. What had he done? Destroyed property that didn't belong to him? Confirmed every suspicion about his own character that his absence from church had already planted? Given his mother's critics ammunition for their whispered concerns about her son's spiritual condition? Daniel started, but had no words to explain the fury that had consumed him. He looked at the broken statue, at the shocked faces surrounding him, at the phones still recording his moment of destructive rage. In 30 seconds, he'd undone years of careful neutrality, announcing to his entire community exactly what he thought of their faith. Without another word, he turned and ran, leaving behind the fragments of stone and the stunned silence that followed his moment of unforgivable anger. By the time he reached home, the video was already circulating on social media. His phone had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The reckoning he'd spent 3 years avoiding had finally arrived, and there was nowhere left to run. Daniel spent the rest of Sunday hiding in his bedroom while his phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages he couldn't bear to answer. Through his window, he watched neighbors walking past their house, some slowing to peer at their front door with expressions of curiosity and judgment. The video had spread faster than he'd imagined possible, shared across Facebook pages and parish group chats, with captions ranging from shocked disbelief to righteous condemnation. His mother had returned from Mass in tears, her face pale with humiliation. She'd knocked on his bedroom door twice, each time asking if he was ready to talk, and each time accepting his silence as an answer. The quiet in their house felt different now, heavier, more fragile, as if the wrong word might shatter what remained of their relationship. Monday morning brought a text from Alex. "Dude, what happened? The video is everywhere, call me." But Daniel couldn't explain what he didn't understand himself. The rage that had consumed him felt foreign in retrospect, like watching someone else's breakdown from a distance. He'd kicked a statue because his mother lit a candle. The disproportion of it embarrassed him almost as much as the act itself. Henderson's Hardware provided temporary refuge. His boss, Mr. Henderson, mentioned the incident only once, saying quietly, "We all handle grief differently. Son, take whatever time you need." The kindness in those words nearly broke Daniel's composure, but he managed to nod and retreat to the stockroom where he could work alone. Tuesday brought the call he'd been expecting. Father Jim's voice on his phone was gentle but firm. "Daniel, I think we should talk. Could you come by the church this afternoon?" "I can't pay for the damage right now," Daniel said immediately. "But I'll work out a payment plan. I know what I did was wrong." "That's not why I'm calling. Just come by around 3 if you would. I'll be in my office." The walk to St. Martin's felt like a march to his own execution. Daniel had spent 3 years avoiding this building, and now he was returning under the worst possible circumstances. The statue stood near the chapel doors exactly where he'd left it, though someone had cleaned up the broken pieces of Mary's hand. The chip on her face looked even more pronounced in daylight, a permanent scar marking his moment of uncontrolled anger. Father Jim's office hadn't changed since Daniel's altar boy days. The same cluttered desk, the same faded photographs of parish events, the same crucifix hanging above the bookshelf. The priest looked older, his hair completely white now, but his eyes held the same patient kindness that had made him Daniel's favorite adult during childhood. "Sit down, Danny," Father Jim said, using the nickname that brought back a flood of memories. "Thank you for coming." Daniel remained standing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "How much is the repair going to cost?" "I can probably pay it off over 6 months if—" "The statue can be fixed," Father Jim interrupted gently. "I'm more concerned about what's broken inside you." The words hit harder than any lecture about property damage or disrespect. Daniel finally sat down, staring at his hands. "I don't know what happened. I got angry." "About your father?" Daniel's throat tightened. Of course, Father Jim would understand the connection. He'd presided over Michael Kessler's funeral, had seen the family's devastation, had probably been fielding questions about Daniel's absence from church for 3 years. "Mum keeps texting me about God and faith and how Dad is in a better place," Daniel said. I don't believe that anymore, and I don't know how to tell her without destroying her." Father Jim leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "Your mother's faith is helping her survive her grief. Your anger is helping you survive yours. Neither response is wrong, but both have consequences. So what am I supposed to do? Pretend I believe things that don't make sense to me? No, Father Jim said simply. But you could stop running from the questions long enough to really examine them. Your father loved this place, loved his faith, even during his darkest times. Kicking that statue didn't hurt God or the church. It hurt you, and it hurt your mother. And it hurt everyone who remembers the boy you used to be. Daniel felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I'm not that boy anymore. No, you're not. You're a young man carrying a tremendous burden of pain and confusion. But you're also Michael Kessler's son, and there was never a more faithful man than your father, even when his illness made faith difficult. His illness? Daniel looked up sharply. You mean his addiction? I mean his pain, physical and spiritual. Addiction is a disease, Danny, not a moral failing. Your father fought it every day, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, but he never stopped believing that God loved him, even when he couldn't love himself. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on grief and faith and the complicated relationship between human suffering and divine love. Father Jim didn't try to convince Daniel to return to church or reclaim his childhood beliefs. Instead, he offered something unexpected, a way to repair the damage Daniel had caused. Come back every afternoon for 2 weeks, Father Jim said. Help me restore the statue properly. Learn something about the craft, about patience, about making beautiful things from broken pieces. If you still want nothing to do with this place when we're finished, I'll respect that decision. Daniel wanted to refuse, to maintain his distance from everything that reminded him of his lost faith. But the guilt of his public outburst, combined with Father Jim's unexpected gentleness, made refusal impossible. 2 weeks, he agreed reluctantly, and then we're done. 2 weeks, Father Jim nodded. We'll see what happens after that. That evening, Daniel called his mother to his room and showed her a small cardboard box he'd retrieved from his closet. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was his childhood rosary, the one his father had given him for his first communion, carved from olive wood and blessed by a priest in Jerusalem. I found this today, he said quietly. I thought you might want it back. Margaret took the rosary with trembling hands, her fingers tracing the familiar beads. Why are you giving this to me? Because I don't deserve to keep it, not after what I did. His mother was quiet for a long moment, then reached over and pressed the rosary back into his hands. Your father gave this to you, not to me. What you did was wrong, but it doesn't erase who you are or where you come from. Keep it even if you can't use it right now. Sometimes we need to hold on to things until we're ready to understand them. That night, Daniel placed the rosary on his nightstand next to his father's prayer book. He didn't pray, but for the first time in months, he slept peacefully, dreaming of marble dust and patient hands, teaching him to make broken things whole again. The second week of statue restoration began with Daniel arriving 10 minutes early, tools in hand, and a thermos of coffee he'd bought for Father Jim. The priest accepted both gestures without comment, though Daniel caught him smiling as he unwrapped. The marble epoxy and fine grit sandpaper Daniel had purchased with his own money. You've been researching, Father Jim observed, examining the professional-grade materials. YouTube University, Daniel admitted. Turns out there are dozens of videos about marble repair. Who knew? They worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, Daniel carefully sanding the rough edges where Mary's hand had broken, while Father Jim mixed the adhesive compound that would hold the pieces together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the chapel courtyard, and Daniel found himself remembering similar moments from his altar boy days, the peaceful rhythm of preparation, the satisfaction of careful attention to sacred details. Your father used to help with repairs around here, Father Jim said casually, not looking up from his mixing bowl. He had good hands for detail work before the accident. Daniel paused in his sanding. I didn't know that. Oh, yes. He rebuilt the altar rail after someone backed into it with a truck, fixed the leaky roof in the sacristy, even helped me restore some of the older statues when they got damaged by weather. Father Jim glanced at Daniel with knowing eyes. Seems like attention to craftsmanship runs in the family. He never told me about any of that. Your father was a humble man. He didn't talk much about his good works. Father Jim set down his mixing bowl and looked directly at Daniel. He also didn't talk much about his struggles, which might not have been the best choice for your family. Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied discussions of his father. What do you mean? I mean he carried his pain alone, even when it was destroying him. Especially during those last months, when the medication stopped helping and he was too proud to ask for additional support. Father Jim picked up a broken piece of the statue's hand, examining it carefully. Did you know he came to see me 3 weeks before he died? The sanding block slipped from Daniel's fingers. What? He was trying to get clean, had been attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings for 2 months, working with a sponsor, following the 12-step program. He wanted to make amends to you and your mother, but he was waiting until he had 90 days sober. Daniel stared at Father Jim, his mind reeling. You never told me this. He asked me not to, if the program didn't work out. He didn't want to. Raise your hopes only to disappoint you again. Father Jim's voice carried 3 years of suppressed sorrow. I've regretted honoring that request ever since his funeral. So he was getting better. He was trying to quit. Daniel's voice cracked. On the words, he was trying very hard. But addiction is a cunning disease, Danny. It doesn't care about good intentions or spiritual progress or how much love surrounds a person. Sometimes people die trying to get well, not because they've given up. Daniel found himself sitting heavily on the chapel steps, overwhelmed by this revaluation of his father's final months. All this time, he'd carried the belief that Daniel Kessler had chosen pills over family, had essentially abandoned them through weakness or selfishness. To learn that his father had been fighting, had been planning a return to family life, changed everything Daniel thought he knew about those devastating final weeks. Why are you telling me this now? Daniel asked. Because you're angry at the wrong things. You're angry at God for not saving your father, but maybe God was trying to save him and the disease won out. You're angry at your father for giving up, but he never gave up. He just ran out of time. Father Jim sat down beside Daniel on the steps. And you're angry at yourself for not doing more, but you were just a kid trying to survive your family's crisis. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching traffic pass on the street beyond the school grounds. Daniel felt something fundamental, shifting inside him, not toward faith exactly, but toward a more complex understanding of the tragedy that had shaped his recent years. I found something in his wallet, Daniel said quietly, a 90-day AA chip, but he only had 87 days clean when he died. He carried that chip everywhere, even though he hadn't earned it yet. His sponsor gave it to him as a goal to work toward. Father Jim's voice was gentle. Your father died trying to become the man he wanted to be for his family, but he still died. All that effort, all that hope, and he still ended up alone on a bedroom floor, surrounded by pill bottles. Yes, he did. And that's the part that doesn't make sense, isn't it? The part that makes you question whether there's any point to faith, or hope, or trying to be good in a world that allows such endings. Daniel nodded, surprised by how precisely Father Jim had identified his deepest spiritual struggle. I can't answer those questions for you, Danny. I've been a priest for 45 years, and I still don't understand why some people's stories end in tragedy, despite their best efforts. But I can tell you that your father's effort mattered, even if it didn't save him. His love for you and your mother mattered, even though addiction complicated how he could express it. His faith mattered, even when it wasn't strong enough to heal his sickness. As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret appeared around the corner of the building, carrying a small cooler and wearing the uncertain expression of someone who wasn't sure about her welcome. She'd been bringing lunch for Daniel every day that week, but always leaving it at the edge of the courtyard, rather than approaching directly. "Mum," Daniel called, surprising himself with the invitation in his voice. "Come sit with us." She approached, cautiously, setting down the cooler and perching on the edge of the steps. "I brought sandwiches and those cookies Father Jim likes." "Margaret makes the best oatmeal cookies in the parish," Father Jim told Daniel with genuine warmth. For the first time in months, Daniel felt something approaching normal family connection as the three of them shared lunch in the sunshine. They talked about small things: the weather, Margaret's garden, Father Jim's upcoming retirement plans. But underneath the casual conversation, Daniel sensed the possibility of larger healing, of conversations yet to come that might bridge the distance grief had created between him and his mother. When they returned to work on the statue, Daniel noticed that his movements had become more reverent, more careful. He was no longer just repairing damage. He was creating something beautiful from broken pieces, exactly as Father Jim had promised. And for the first time since his father's death, that felt like a metaphor worth believing in. 3 weeks into the restoration project, Daniel's daily routine had settled into something resembling peace. He would finish his morning shift at Henderson's Hardware, grab lunch from the deli on Oak Street, and arrive at St. Martin's by 2 o'clock, with tools and materials carefully organized in his father's old toolbox. Another artifact Margaret had quietly placed by the front door without explanation. The statue was taking shape beautifully. Mary's face bore only the faintest scar where Daniel's kick had chipped the marble, and her reconstructed hand seemed even more graceful than the original. Daniel had discovered an unexpected talent for the meticulous work, his fingers learning to feel the difference between rough and smooth surfaces, his eye developing sensitivity to proportion and detail. Father Jim had been an excellent teacher, patient with Daniel's questions and generous with praise for his improving craftsmanship. More importantly, he'd created space for conversations that ranged far beyond statue repair. Discussions about doubt and faith, about the relationship between suffering and meaning, about the possibility of finding God in unexpected places. "No," Father Jim said one afternoon while Daniel carefully painted details on Mary's restored fingers. "Your father used to sit right here during his lunch breaks. He'd bring a sandwich and eat it on these steps, watching the children play during recess." Daniel looked up from his work, paintbrush suspended in mid-air. "When was this?" "During the construction of the new gymnasium, about 6 years ago. He was working on that project before his accident, coming by almost daily for 3 months. Father Jim smiled at the memory. "He told me once that watching those children reminded him why he worked so hard, so you could have opportunities he'd never had." The weight of this revelation settled over Daniel like a gentle blanket. His father had spent time in this exact spot, thinking about his son's future, finding motivation in the simple sight of children at play. It connected Daniel to his father's presence in a way that felt almost mystical. "I never knew he worked." "On the gymnasium, you were busy with high school activities, if I remember correctly. Soccer team, wasn't it? And that part-time job at the movie theater." Father Jim dipped his own brush in a pot of gold paint, adding delicate highlights to Mary's robes. "Your father was proud of how responsible you'd become. He used to worry that his problems were forcing you to grow up too fast." Daniel set down his paintbrush, overwhelmed by the complexity of his father's inner life, the love and guilt and hope that Michael had apparently carried without sharing it with his family. "I wish he'd talked to me more, really talked, I mean, about important things." He wanted to, but addiction creates its own isolation. The shame of it convinced him that he had nothing valuable to offer you, even though that wasn't true. "Father," Jim paused in his painting, choosing his words carefully. "He did leave you something, though, something I've been waiting for the right moment to share." From his jacket pocket, Father Jim withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. "He wrote this during his time in treatment, Asked me to give it to you if anything happened to him, but only when you were ready to receive it. Daniel stared at the paper as if it might explode. A message from his father, written in anticipation of death, preserved for 3 years until this moment. His hands trembled as he unfolded the single sheet of notebook paper covered in his father's. Familiar handwriting. "Danny," the letter began, "if Father Jim is giving you this, then I didn't make it back from the darkness that's been chasing me. I want you to know that every day I fought to stay alive was a day I fought to come home to. You and your mother. The pills didn't take me because I stopped loving you. They took me because they were stronger than my love, at least in the end. You are the best thing I ever did in this world. Every time I see you serve at Mass, every time you help your mother, without being asked, every time you show kindness to someone who needs it, I know that my life has meant something important. You have your mother's goodness and my stubborn determination, and that combination is going to take you places I could never imagine. I know you're angry at God right now, and maybe at me too. That's okay. Faith isn't about never having doubts, it's about wrestling with those doubts until you find something stronger on the other side. Your mother's faith is different from yours, and yours will be different from mine, but all 3 paths lead to the same love. Take care of your mother. Forgive her when she clings too tightly to rituals that comfort her. And forgive me for leaving before I could teach you all the things a father should pass on to his son. You're going to have to learn some of life's lessons the hard way, but I have absolute confidence in the man you're becoming. I love you more than my addiction, even though the addiction won. Remember that when you think about how this story ended. Sometimes love isn't enough to win, but it's always enough to matter. Your father, Michael. Daniel read the letter twice before the words fully registered. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet, next to his driver's license. And the photograph of his family from happier times. He felt hollowed out and filled up simultaneously, as if grief had made room for something else to grow. "Thank you," he whispered to Father Jim. He was a good man, fighting a terrible disease. Father Jim replied, "I hope you can remember him that way." They worked the rest of the afternoon in contemplative silence, adding finishing touches to Mary's robes and polishing surfaces that already gleamed. As the sun began to set behind the chapel, Daniel stepped back to admire their work. The statue looked magnificent. Not perfect, perhaps, but beautiful in a way that acknowledged both damage and healing. "She's almost finished," Father Jim observed. "Almost," Daniel agreed. Then, surprising himself, he added, "Father Jim, would it be okay if I came to Mass on Sunday, just to see how the statue looks in the morning light?" Father Jim's smile could have powered the chapel's lighting system. "I think that would be very okay indeed." That evening, Daniel showed his father's letter to his mother. She read it through tears, then held Daniel close in a way she hadn't since he was small. "He loved us so much," she whispered. "I know," Daniel replied, "and for the first time in 3 years he truly did." Sunday morning arrived with the kind of golden light that made ordinary things look sacred. Daniel woke before his alarm, filled with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He'd chosen his clothes carefully the night before, not his Sunday best, which had long since been outgrown or donated, but clean khakis and a button-down shirt that split the difference between casual and respectful. Margaret was already awake when he emerged from his bedroom, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and rosary. She looked up with surprise and barely contained hope. "Are you coming with me today?" she asked carefully, as if the wrong tone might shatter his resolve. "I want to see how the statue looks in the morning light," Daniel said, then added more softly, "and I want to sit with you. If that's okay." His mother's smile was radiant. "Of course it's okay. We can walk together, like we used to." The walk to St. Martin's felt both foreign and familiar, like returning to a childhood home after years away. Daniel noticed details he'd forgotten. The way Mrs. Chen tended her garden with religious devotion, how the Morales family always arrived exactly 7 minutes early for Mass, the sound of the bell that had marked the rhythm of his young life. As they approached the chapel, Daniel felt his anxiety spike. He hadn't been inside this building for 3 years, hadn't faced this community since the viral video of his rage had circulated through their phones and conversations. Part of him expected pointing fingers and whispered judgments. Instead, he found something unexpected: genuine warmth. Mrs. Patterson, his former second-grade teacher, squeezed his shoulder and whispered, "Welcome back, dear." Mr. Rodriguez nodded respectfully and said, "Beautiful work on the statue, son." Even Sister Mary Catherine, who had every right to be angry about his destructive outburst, smiled and patted his hand as he passed her pew. The statue stood near the altar now, relocated for the special blessing ceremony that would conclude its restoration. In the soft morning light filtering through stained glass windows, Mary's face seemed to glow with an inner peace that transcended the marble from which she was carved. The scar from Daniel's kick was still visible if you knew where to look, but it had been transformed into something that added character rather than detracting from beauty. "She's magnificent," Margaret whispered, and Daniel had to agree. Father Jim's homily that morning was about transformation, how God could take the broken pieces of human lives and create something new and beautiful from the fragments. Daniel wondered if the words were directed at him specifically, but looking around the congregation, he saw other faces that carried their own burdens, their own need for restoration. Perhaps everyone here was broken in some way, seeking healing through ritual and community. During the consecration, when Father Jim raised the bread and wine, Daniel found himself paying attention in a way he hadn't since childhood. The familiar words washed over him. "This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for the forgiveness of sins." And while he couldn't claim to believe them literally, he could feel their power as symbols of love and sacrifice. When communion time arrived, Daniel remained in his pew, while his mother went forward to receive the Eucharist. He wasn't ready for that level of participation, might never be ready, but he no longer felt angry about others finding meaning in what he couldn't accept. Faith was personal and complicated. He was beginning to understand, and there were many ways to seek the sacred. After Mass, Father Jim invited Daniel and Margaret to join him for the statue's blessing ceremony. A small crowd had gathered in the courtyard, including several parishioners who had witnessed Daniel's original outburst. As Father Jim sprinkled holy water over the restored statue and offered prayers of gratitude, Daniel felt a complex mixture of pride and humility. "This statue has become a symbol of redemption for our community," Father Jim announced. "It reminds us that broken things can be made beautiful again, that second chances are always possible, that love is stronger than anger." His eyes found Daniel in the small crowd. "We are grateful to all who participated in this restoration, especially those who worked with such dedication and skill to heal what was damaged." The applause that followed felt like absolution. Daniel's cheeks burned with embarrassment and gratitude. As neighbors he'd known his entire life expressed appreciation for his craftsmanship and implicitly forgiveness for his destructive moment. Later, as the crowd dispersed and Daniel helped Father Jim clean up the blessing ceremony supplies, the priest made an unexpected observation. "You know, Danny, I've been thinking about your future. Have you ever considered studying art?" Daniel paused in his folding of chairs. "Art? You have real talent for restoration work, and there's a whole field called sacred art conservation, specialists who travel around repairing and preserving religious artwork in churches, museums, and private collections." Father Jim's eyes twinkled with possibility. "It combines craftsmanship with history, spirituality with practical skill. Might be worth exploring." The suggestion planted a seed in Daniel's mind. He'd been drifting through community college without direction, unsure what he wanted to do with his life. But these past weeks of careful, reverent work had awakened something in him. A desire to create beauty, to preserve meaningful things, to work with his hands in service of something larger than himself. "Would I have to be religious to do that kind of work?" Daniel asked. "No," Father Jim replied thoughtfully, "but you'd have to respect the religious significance of what you're preserving. You'd have to understand that for many people, these objects are sacred, even if they're not sacred to you personally." As Daniel walked home with his mother, he found himself looking at the world with new eyes. The stained glass windows of St. Martin's caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the sidewalk. The ancient oak trees that lined Maple Street seemed to whisper stories of all the generations that had walked beneath their branches. Even the simple act of walking beside his mother felt like a form of prayer, a quiet gratitude for second chances and the possibility of healing. That evening, Daniel researched art conservation programs online while his mother prepared dinner. The work looked challenging but deeply satisfying, requiring both technical skill and historical knowledge, patience and creativity. For the first time since high school, he felt excited about his future rather than merely anxious about it. "Mom," he called from his laptop, "what would you think if I transferred to State University to study art conservation?" Margaret appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand and hope in her eyes. "I think your father would be very proud," she said simply, and Daniel knew she was right. 2 months after the statue's restoration, Daniel was cleaning out his father's remaining belongings when he discovered the manila envelope tucked behind a loose board in Michael's workshop. The envelope was thick and sealed, with important documents written in his father's careful handwriting across the front. Inside, Daniel found his father's final medical records, insurance papers, and buried beneath administrative paperwork, the official medical examiner's report from the coroner's office. He'd never seen this document before. His mother had handled all the funeral arrangements and legal matters, while Daniel was still too stunned with grief to participate meaningfully. The clinical language of the report made his father's death sound routine, just another case number processed through the county medical system. But as Daniel read more carefully, one paragraph stopped him cold. "Deceased expired from acute respiratory depression caused by accidental overdose of oxycodone. Toxicology analysis indicates levels consistent with therapeutic doses of recently. Prescribed medication combined with residual amounts of previously prescribed higher-strength tablets found at scene. Investigation concluded no evidence of intentional self-harm. Death ruled accidental." Daniel read the paragraph 3 times before its implications fully registered. Accidental overdose. No evidence of intentional self-harm. His father hadn't chosen to leave them. He died by mistake. With shaking hands, Daniel sorted through the other papers until he found what he was looking for: the prescription records from his father's final weeks. The timeline they revealed was devastating in its clarity. Michael had been prescribed a lower-dose pain medication as part of his recovery program, carefully monitored amounts designed to help him function while weaning off the stronger pills that had dominated his final years. But mixed in with the new prescription bottles, the medical examiner had found 3 tablets from an older, much stronger prescription. Pills that had been discontinued months earlier, but apparently overlooked. In a bathroom medicine cabinet, Michael had taken his prescribed evening dose, then unknowingly ingested what he thought were the same pills, but were actually 3 times stronger than what his body could handle in his newly reduced state of tolerance. The death that had shattered Daniel's faith in divine love, the overdose that had convinced him God didn't care about human suffering, had been a tragic accident. A mix-up of medications that occurred while his father was actively trying to get well. Daniel sank into his father's workshop chair, surrounded by tools that Michael would never use again, holding papers that rewrote the story of their family's tragedy. All his anger at God for abandoning them, all his resentment toward his father for choosing addiction over family, all his questioning of whether love meant anything in a universe that allowed such cruel endings, all of it built on a misunderstanding of what had actually happened. He called his mother immediately. "Mom, did you know about this?" Daniel asked without preamble when Margaret answered the phone. "Know about what, honey?" "The medical examiner's report. Did you know Dad's overdose?" Was accidental? That he wasn't trying to kill himself? The long silence on the other end of the line told Daniel everything he needed to know. "Mom, answer me. Did you know?" "Yes," Margaret whispered finally. "I knew, and you never told me. For 3 years you let me think Dad chose to leave us. You were so angry already, Danny. So hurt and confused. I thought knowing the details would make it worse somehow. I thought it was better if you could focus on healing rather than dwelling on the specifics of how it happened." Daniel felt a surge of the old rage, but it was different now. Cleaner, more focused. "You let me blame God for taking Dad away when Dad was actually trying to come back to us. You let me destroy my faith over something that wasn't even true. Your faith was already broken, sweetheart. The accident didn't break it. Watching your father suffer for 3 years broke it. Knowing that he died by mistake instead of on purpose wouldn't have changed your anger about why good people have to endure so much pain." Her words carried a terrible logic that Daniel couldn't immediately dispute. Would knowing the truth about the overdose have preserved his faith? Would understanding that his father died trying to get better have made the loss easier to bear? Or would it have simply shifted his anger from God's cruelty to God's indifference? Why allow such a senseless accident to occur just when healing seemed possible? "I deserve to know the truth," Daniel said quietly. "We both deserve to know what really happened." "You're right," Margaret admitted. "I was trying to protect you, but I was wrong. I should have trusted you to handle the truth, even when it was complicated and painful." That evening, Daniel drove to St. Martin's and found Father Jim in his office, working on Sunday's homily by lamplight. The priest looked up with surprise. When Daniel knocked on the open door, "Danny, what brings you here so late?" Daniel placed the medical examiner's report on Father Jim's desk without a word. The priest read it carefully, his expression growing more solemn with each paragraph. "You didn't know either," Daniel said when Father Jim finished reading. "No, I didn't. Your mother never shared these details with me. I assumed what you assumed, that your father's death was intentional, a final surrender to the disease that had been consuming him. So all those conversations we had about faith and suffering and God's mysterious ways, they were based on something that never actually happened." Father Jim set down the papers and looked directly at Daniel. "Does knowing this change how you feel about God?" The question caught Daniel off guard. He'd expected sympathy, perhaps shared outrage at the cosmic unfairness of it all. Instead, Father Jim was asking him to examine his own spiritual response to this new information. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I've been angry at God for letting Dad choose death over family. But if Dad didn't choose to die, if he was actually trying to live, then what am I supposed to be angry about? Maybe you're supposed to be angry that good people suffer at all. Maybe you're supposed to be angry that diseases like addiction exist in the first place. Maybe you're supposed to be angry that we live in a world where mistakes can have fatal consequences." Father Jim leaned back in his chair. "Or maybe you're supposed to discover that your father's accidental death was still meaningful, still part of a larger story about love and loss and the courage it takes to keep hoping in the face of uncertainty." Daniel left the church that night with more questions than answers, but they were different questions now. Deeper ones, more complex ones. Questions that didn't assume God's indifference, but wondered instead about the relationship between divine love and human freedom, between spiritual hope and earthly tragedy. The truth about his father's death hadn't restored his faith, but it had cleared space for faith to return, if he chose to let it. The weeks following Daniel's discovery of the medical examiner's report felt like living in a house where all the furniture had been rearranged overnight. Everything looked familiar, but occupied different spaces, requiring him to navigate by touch rather than memory. His anger hadn't disappeared. It had transformed into something more complex and harder to direct. He found himself spending more time at St. Martin's, not for formal worship, but for the quiet spaces where he could think without interruption. The restored statue had become a kind of meditation focus for him, its scarred but beautiful face reflecting his own journey from destruction towards something that might eventually resemble wholeness. Father Jim had suggested he speak with Dr. Sarah Chen, a grief counselor who specialized in complicated loss. She was Alex's older sister, which made the referral feel less clinical and more like family looking out for family. Daniel had resisted the idea initially. He'd spent 3 years avoiding therapy, convinced that his problems were spiritual rather than psychological. But the revelation about his father's accidental death had shaken his certainty about everything. Grief is like water, Dr. Chen explained during their first session. It finds every crack in your foundation and settles there until you address it directly. The fact that your father's death was accidental doesn't erase the trauma of watching him struggle with addiction for 3 years. It just changes the story you tell yourself about what that trauma means. Daniel discovered that talking to a professional about his father's addiction was different from his conversations with Father Jim. Dr. Chen helped him understand the science behind opioid dependency, the way prescription medications could hijack brain chemistry regardless of a person's moral character or spiritual strength. She explained how addiction created its own isolation, making it difficult for sufferers to maintain the very relationships that might have provided support for recovery. Your father wasn't choosing pills over family, Dr. Chen said during one particularly intense session. He was battling a disease that convinced him he needed medication to function normally. The tragedy isn't that he was weak, it's that he was fighting so hard and still lost. These conversations began to shift Daniel's understanding of the past 3 years. Instead of seeing his father as someone who had abandoned his family, he began to recognize Michael as someone who had been drowning while trying to appear fine on the surface. The anger that had sustained Daniel through his grief began to evolve into something more like compassion. Meanwhile, his relationship with his mother was slowly healing. They'd started having dinner together every evening, sharing stories about Michael that they'd been too hurt to discuss before. Margaret revealed details about her husband's recovery attempts that she'd kept private out of respect for his dignity. The meetings he'd attended, the sponsor he'd worked with, the plans he'd made for their future together. He was going to surprise you with a trip when he reached 90 days clean, Margaret told Daniel one evening while they washed dishes together. He'd been saving money from odd jobs, planning to take you camping in the mountains like you used to do when you were small. Daniel had to set down the plate he was drying and take a deep breath. The image of his father secretly planning a celebration, working toward a future that had been cut short by a medication mix-up, was almost too painful to bear. "I wish I'd known he was trying so hard," Daniel said. He didn't want to disappoint you again if the program didn't work. He figured it was better to surprise you with success than to promise something he might not be able to deliver. As spring turned toward summer, Daniel made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He applied for early admission to State University's Art Conservation Program, submitting a portfolio that included detailed photographs of the Virgin Mary statue restoration, along with an essay about finding purpose through preservation of sacred art. The essay had been the hardest part to write. How do you explain to an admissions committee that your interest in conservation began with an act of destruction? How do you describe the spiritual journey that led from kicking a statue in rage to restoring it with reverence? Daniel had struggled through multiple drafts before finding the right balance of honesty and hope. "Sometimes we have to break something before we can understand how to fix it," he'd written in his final draft. "My work restoring the Virgin Mary statue taught me that healing isn't about returning to an original state. It's about creating something new and beautiful from the pieces that remain." The acceptance letter arrived on a Thursday in June. Daniel was accepted not just into the program, but offered a partial scholarship based on the strength of his portfolio and essay. Father Jim insisted on taking Daniel and Margaret out for a celebration dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. "Your father would be incredibly proud," Father Jim said, raising his glass of iced tea and a toast. "Art conservation is noble work. You'll be preserving beauty and meaning for future generations." As summer progressed, Daniel found himself preparing for university in ways that felt both practical and spiritual. He was studying art history, learning about different restoration techniques, researching the programs that would shape his career. But he was also wrestling with deeper questions about what his father's accidental death meant for his own faith journey. The anger that had driven him for 3 years was fading, but it wasn't being replaced by his childhood certainty. Instead, Daniel was discovering something more mature and complex, a willingness to live with mystery, to find meaning in questions rather than demanding simple answers. "I don't know if I believe in God the way I used to," he told Father Jim during one of their regular conversations. "But I believe in love, and in second chances, and in the possibility of making beautiful things from broken pieces. Maybe that's enough for now. Maybe it's more than enough," Father Jim replied with a smile. "Maybe it's exactly where you're supposed to be." As August approached and Daniel prepared to leave for university, he realized that his journey had come full circle in ways he never could have anticipated. The young man who had kicked a statue in fury was now preparing to dedicate his life to preserving sacred art. The son who had blamed God for his father's abandonment now understood that his father had died trying to come home on his last Sunday. Before leaving for State University, Daniel made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He asked Father Jim if he could serve as altar assistant for the morning mass, just as he had done as a boy, not because his faith had returned unchanged, but because he wanted to honor the memory of the father who had been so proud of his service, and the community that had welcomed him back, despite his moment of destructive anger. Standing at the altar that morning, wearing vestments that felt both familiar and strange, Daniel realized that healing wasn't about returning to who you used to be. It was about becoming who you were meant to be, carrying your scars as reminders of grace rather than evidence of failure. The morning of Daniel's final Mass as altar server dawned clear and bright, with the kind of golden light that seemed to bless everything it touched. He woke earlier than necessary, filled with nervous energy that reminded him of his first day. Serving as a 10-year-old boy, the white alb and cincture lay pressed and ready on his dresser. Father Jim had retrieved them from storage, somehow still fitting despite the years that had passed. Daniel slipped his father's wedding ring on too, his finger, a ritual he'd begun after finding Michael's letter. The simple gold band felt substantial against his skin, a tangible connection to the man who had once been so proud to watch his son serve at this same altar. Today felt like completing a circle that had been broken by addiction, death, and doubt. Margaret was waiting in the kitchen when he emerged, dressed in her finest dress and holding a small, wrapped package. "I have something for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father asked me to give this to you when you were ready to understand it." Inside the tissue paper was Daniel's baptismal certificate, the same one Father Jim had mentioned during the statue blessing ceremony. But tucked behind it was something Daniel had never seen before. A photograph of himself as a baby being held over the baptismal font, with Michael and Margaret flanking Father Jim in the background. His father's face in the picture radiated pure joy and hope. "He carried this in his wallet," Margaret explained. "Even during the worst times, he never stopped believing you were destined for something important." Daniel studied the photograph, seeing his father's faith captured in that younger face, understanding now that Michael's addiction had never diminished his love for his family. It had only complicated how he could express it. The walk to St. Martin's felt ceremonial, each step carrying weight beyond the simple act of movement. Daniel noticed details with heightened awareness. The way morning light caught the stained glass windows, how the church bells seemed to ring with particular clarity, the familiar faces of parishioners arriving for Mass with expressions of anticipation, rather than routine obligation. Word had spread through the parish about Daniel's return to altar service. As he and Margaret approached the church, Daniel saw that the usual Sunday crowd had swelled considerably. Mrs. Patterson waved from the steps. Mr. Rodriguez nodded with approval. Even some teenagers from the youth group had come, curious to witness what many were calling a miracle of forgiveness and redemption. Sister Mary Catherine met them at the entrance with a smile that erased years of worry. "Welcome home, Daniel," she said simply, and he understood that she meant it in every possible sense. In the sacristy, Father Jim helped Daniel adjust his vestments with the same patience he'd shown 20 years earlier. The priest's hands shook, slightly with age, but his movements retained their reverent precision. "Are you nervous?" Father Jim asked. "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "What if I forget the responses? What if I mess up the movements? Then you'll be human, just like the rest of us. God doesn't require perfection, Danny, just sincerity, Father." Jim placed his hands on Daniel's shoulders. "Your father would be so proud to see you here this morning." As they prepared to process into the church, Daniel felt a moment of pure panic. The last time he'd been the center of attention in this community, it had been as the angry young man who'd destroyed their statue. Now he was returning as, what? A believer? A doubter seeking meaning? A prodigal son trying to make amends? "I don't know if I have faith the way everyone expects me to," Daniel whispered to Father Jim. "Faith isn't about meeting other people's expectations," the priest replied. "It's about being open to mystery, to love, to the possibility that broken things can be made whole again. You've already demonstrated more faith than you realize." The opening hymn began, and Daniel found himself processing down the center aisle of St. Martin's for the first time in nearly a decade. The faces in the pews showed a mixture of emotions: joy, curiosity, hope, and in some cases tears. He spotted his mother in their traditional third pew seat, her face radiant with pride and gratitude. As they reached the altar, Daniel's eyes found the restored Virgin Mary statue, now permanently installed in a place of honor near the tabernacle. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated her face, making the small scar from his kick visible but somehow beautiful, a reminder that healing often incorporates wounds rather than erasing them entirely. The Mass proceeded with familiar rhythms that felt both strange and natural. Daniel's hands remembered the movements even when his mind questioned their meaning. During the readings, he found himself listening to ancient words with new ears, hearing themes of redemption and second chances that resonated differently now that he understood his own story more completely. When Father Jim began his homily, Daniel realized the priest had crafted his message specifically for this moment. Today, we celebrate not just the return of a young man to our altar, but the truth that God's love is larger than our anger, more persistent than our doubt, and more creative than our ability to imagine second chances. Daniel felt his cheeks burn as hundreds of eyes focused on him, but for the first time, the attention felt like blessing rather than judgment. These people had watched him grow up, had witnessed his family's tragedy, had seen his moment of destructive rage, and now they were welcoming him back with the kind of unconditional love that he was beginning to understand might be what people meant when they talked about divine grace. During the consecration, as Daniel knelt beside Father Jim and watched the familiar ritual of bread and wine being transformed into something sacred, he felt a stirring of something he hadn't experienced in years. Not the simple faith of his childhood, but something more complex and mature, an openness to mystery, a willingness to believe that love might be stronger than loss, that meaning could emerge from suffering, that broken people and broken things might find new purposes through the patience and care of communities willing to practice forgiveness. When Father Jim raised the consecrated bread and proclaimed, "Behold the Lamb of God," Behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Daniel found himself believing, not in all the theological details he'd once accepted without question, but in the possibility that this ritual pointed towards something real and transformative, something worth serving, even when understanding remained incomplete. As communion time approached, Daniel felt the weight of decision settling over him like a familiar garment. For 3 years, he'd remained in the pews during this most sacred moment, unwilling to participate in a ritual that no longer held meaning for him. But today, standing at the altar in vestments that connected him to his childhood faith, he found himself facing a choice that would define not just this morning, but his understanding of his own spiritual journey. Father Jim's eyes met, his with gentle inquiry, a question without pressure, an invitation without obligation. The priest held Daniel's baptismal certificate, the document that testified to his original welcome into this faith community, his first immersion in the mystery they were now celebrating together. This certificate represents your beginning in faith, Father Jim said quietly, his words meant for Daniel alone. But faith isn't something that happens once and remains unchanged. It grows, breaks, heals, deepens, questions, and discovers new meanings throughout our lives. Daniel looked out at the congregation, faces that had known him since childhood, people who had watched him serve faithfully as a boy, who had witnessed his family's tragedy, who had seen his moment of destructive anger, and who were now welcoming him back with expressions of love and acceptance that seemed to transcend any specific doctrinal requirements. His mother sat in the third pew with tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness but of joy so profound it couldn't be contained. Beside her, Mrs. Chen from the neighborhood smiled with the gentle pride of someone who had helped nurture countless children through their spiritual journeys. Throughout the church, Daniel saw faces that told stories of their own struggles with faith, doubt, loss, and the difficult work of believing in love, despite evidence that the world could be cruel and senseless. "I don't know if I believe everything the church teaches," Daniel whispered to Father Jim. "Neither do I some days," the priest replied with surprising honesty. "But I believe in love, in forgiveness, in the possibility of transformation, and in the sacred worth of every person seeking meaning in this complicated world." Sometimes that's enough to start with. Daniel made his decision not with his mind, but with his heart. Not because doubt had been eliminated, but because love had become stronger than uncertainty. He stepped forward to receive communion for the first time in 3 years, not as a declaration of restored childhood faith, but as an act of hope. Hope that mystery could coexist with questions, that belonging didn't require perfect belief, that grace might be large enough to encompass even the most complicated spiritual journeys. As Father Jim placed the consecrated bread in Daniel's hands, the young man felt something shift inside his chest. Not the dramatic conversion of religious stories, but a quiet settling, like a dislocated bone, clicking back into its proper place. The bread tasted like bread, but the act of receiving it felt like coming home to a place he'd never entirely left, even during his years of exile. When communion ended and the final hymn began, Daniel realized that the transformation he'd experienced wasn't about returning to who he used to be. It was about becoming who he was always meant to be. The boy who had served at this altar with simple, unquestioning faith was gone forever, replaced by a young man whose faith would always carry questions, and whose questions would always be held within a larger framework of love and hope. After Mass, as Daniel helped Father Jim remove his vestments in the sacristy, the priest made an observation that would stay with him for years to come. "You know, Danny, I think your father would be proud, not just that you returned to serve, but that you returned as yourself. Not trying to pretend the doubts and struggles never happened, but bringing them along as part of your story." The reception that followed in the parish hall was unlike anything Daniel had experienced. Parishioners who had known him as a child approached with stories about his father's quiet acts of service, sharing memories that painted a picture of Daniel Kessler as a man who had struggled with addiction while never losing his fundamental kindness and love for others. Mr. Rodriguez pulled Daniel aside to share a story he'd never heard. "Your father helped my family when I was out of work for 6 months. Never made a big deal about it, just quietly paid our grocery bill and told the store to charge it to his account. We only found out after he died, when the manager mentioned it during his funeral." Mrs. Patterson added her own memory. "He used to shovel my driveway every time it snowed, never asked for anything in return. Even during the worst of his illness, he'd still show up with that old shovel and clear the path to my front door." These stories revealed a version of his father that Daniel was only now beginning to understand. Not a saint who had fallen from grace, but a complicated human being who had carried both illness and love, weakness and generosity, addiction and faith in the same struggling heart. As the afternoon sun streamed through the parish hall windows, Daniel found himself surrounded by the community that had shaped his childhood, had mourned his father's death, had witnessed his moment of destructive anger, and was now celebrating his return with the kind of unconditional acceptance that felt like a glimpse of divine love made manifest in human relationships. Alex Chen appeared beside him, having driven home from State University specifically for this Mass. "So," his best friend said with a grin, "I guess this means you're not an angry atheist anymore?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I'm still angry sometimes, and I still have doubts, but I guess I've learned that anger and doubt don't have to be the only things that define you. Sometimes they can be the beginning of something deeper." As the reception wound down, and people began to say their goodbyes, Daniel realized that this morning had been a climax, not just of his own spiritual journey, but of his family's long process of healing. The young man who would leave for State University in 2 weeks was fundamentally different from the teenager who had watched his father die in bitterness and confusion. Standing in the doorway of St. Martin's as the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the courtyard, Daniel touched the restored Virgin Mary statue one final time. The scar on her face was barely visible now, incorporated into her expression of peace rather than detracting from it. Like his own wounds, it had become part of the beauty rather than a flaw to be hidden. He was ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Daniel knelt in the restoration lab at State University, carefully applying gold leaf to a damaged medieval altarpiece that had been damaged by centuries of candle smoke and neglect. His hands moved with the same patient precision he'd learned during those transformative weeks, repairing the Virgin Mary statue, but his understanding of the work had deepened considerably. The art conservation program had challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Beyond the technical skills of cleaning, repairing, and preserving artistic works, he was learning about the cultural and spiritual contexts that gave these objects meaning. His professors had noted his unusual sensitivity to religious art, his ability to understand not just the craft, but the devotion that had originally inspired these creations. His dorm room reflected this evolution. Beside his textbooks on conservation, techniques, and art history, he kept his father's prayer book and the letter Michael had written during his recovery attempts. On his desk sat a small framed photograph of the restored Virgin Mary statue, a reminder of where his journey toward healing had truly begun. The prayer journal Father Jim had given him as a farewell gift lay open beside his laptop, filled not with traditional prayers, but with reflections on faith, doubt, and the complex relationship between human suffering and divine love. Daniel had discovered that writing helped him process the spiritual questions that his academic work constantly raised. "Dear God, if you're listening," read his most recent entry, "I spent today working on a painting of the crucifixion that's been damaged by water and time. As I cleaned away centuries of dirt and overpainting, the original colors began to emerge, more vibrant and beautiful than anyone had expected. I keep thinking about how restoration isn't about returning something to a perfect state, but about revealing the beauty that was always there, even when it was hidden by damage. Maybe that's what you've been doing with me all along. His relationship with his mother had continued to strengthen throughout his first semester. They spoke by phone every Sunday evening, sharing details about their weeks, their hopes, their memories of Michael. Margaret had joined a support group for families affected by addiction, finding community with others who understood the complex grief that comes from loving someone struggling with mental illness. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming," she'd told him during their last conversation. "Your father always said you'd find your own way to faith, even if it looked different from ours." I think he was right. The university's Newman Center had become an unexpected source of community for Daniel. Unlike his childhood parish, this campus ministry attracted students from diverse backgrounds who were wrestling with their own complicated relationships to faith. Daniel found himself serving as a mentor to other young people whose religious certainty had been shaken by loss, doubt, or disillusionment. "I don't have answers," he would tell them during their informal discussion groups. "But I've learned that questions can be sacred too, if we hold them with enough love and patience." Father Jim visited campus once during the fall semester, taking Daniel to dinner and marveling at how much he'd grown in just a few months. The aging priest was preparing for retirement, but his eyes still sparkled with the same wisdom that had guided Daniel through his darkest period. "You know," Father Jim said over dessert, "I've been thinking about that statue restoration. When we started, I thought the project was about repairing damage to church property, but I realize now it was about repairing damage to your heart and to your family's ability to heal from your father's death." "Do you think Dad knew?" Daniel asked. "Somehow, do you think he knew that kicking that statue would eventually lead me back to something resembling faith?" Father Jim considered the question carefully. "I think your father knew you better than you knew yourself. He trusted that your anger came from love, and that love would eventually guide you toward healing. Maybe he didn't know the specific details, but he knew you had the strength to find your way through the darkness." As spring semester approached, Daniel received an unexpected opportunity. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had accepted him for a summer internship in their conservation lab, where he would work alongside master conservators on some of the world's most precious religious artifacts. The position would provide invaluable experience and connections that could shape his entire career, but perhaps more significantly, the museum's collection included several pieces that had been damaged during times of political upheaval, artworks that had been broken by people struggling with their own anger and disillusionment, then carefully restored by craftspeople who understood that destruction and creation could be part of the same larger story of human meaning-making. On a warm spring evening, as Daniel walked across campus after finishing work on the medieval altarpiece, he found himself stopping at the Newman Center's small chapel. He didn't come here to pray in any traditional sense, but rather to sit quietly and reflect on the journey that had brought him from destructive rage to redemptive craftsmanship. The chapel's simple altar held a modern crucifix, not ornate like the artifacts he studied in his conservation classes, but beautiful in its clean lines and honest materials. Daniel sat in the front pew and thought about his father, about the addiction that had complicated Michael's final years, but never eliminated his love for his family. "I think I understand now," Daniel whispered to the quiet space around him. "You didn't abandon us, and Dad didn't abandon us. Sometimes love looks like struggle, and sometimes healing takes longer than we hope. But that doesn't mean the love isn't real, or that the healing isn't worth waiting for." As he prepared to leave the chapel, Daniel noticed a young woman sitting in the back pew, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Without hesitation, he approached and sat beside her, offering the kind of presence that Father Jim had once offered him, Patient, non-judgmental, willing to sit with someone else's pain without trying to fix it immediately. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She looked up with eyes that held familiar anger and confusion. "My brother overdosed last week. Everyone keeps telling me God has a plan. But I can't understand what kind of plan includes letting good people die from diseases they can't control." Daniel felt his heart recognize her anguish. He thought about the prayer journal in his dorm room, about the conversations with Dr. Chen that had helped him understand addiction as illness rather than moral failure, about the community at St. Martin's that had welcomed him back despite his moment of destructive rage. "I don't know about God's plan," Daniel said quietly, "but I know about love being stronger than loss, and about communities that help us heal when we can't heal alone. Would you like to talk about your brother? Sometimes sharing the stories helps." As they talked through the evening, Daniel realized that his own healing had prepared him to help others navigate similar journeys through grief and doubt toward whatever version of hope might be possible for them. This felt like purpose, not the simple certainty of childhood faith, but the mature calling of someone who had learned to find sacred meaning in the patient work of restoration, whether of damaged art or wounded hearts. 3 years after kicking a statue in rage, Daniel Kessler knelt beside another grieving person and offered the gift he'd received from Father Jim, Dr. Chen, his mother, and ultimately from his father's complicated love, the presence of someone willing to witness pain without judgment and to suggest gently that healing might be possible even when it seemed impossible. Outside the chapel windows, the spring evening was settling into darkness, but inside, 2 young people sat together in candlelight, discovering that sometimes the most sacred conversations begin with honest acknowledgement of doubt and end with tentative hope that love might be larger than loss, that questions might be more valuable than easy answers, and that broken things, including broken hearts and broken faith, might find new purposes through patient care and the willingness to believe in second chances.